I knew something was wrong the second I pulled into my driveway. The air smelled wrong. The scent of fresh-cut wood mixed with raw earth, a scent that didn't belong. And then I saw it. A gaping wound in my front yard, where my daughter's tree had stood just that morning. The trunk was gone, the roots ripped from the earth. A jagged stump remained, hacked down to a splintered mess. I stepped out of my truck, the keys shaking in my grip. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took slow, deliberate steps toward the murder scene. Because that's what it felt like, a murder. I didn't plant that tree for decoration. It wasn't some arbitrary landscaping choice. It was for Emily, my daughter, the little girl I buried 5 years ago after a drunk driver stole her from me. That tree was the last living piece of her, and now it was gone. A tremor started in my hands, climbing up my arms, into my chest. I clenched my fists, breathing hard through my nose. Then I saw the sign, a bright laminated notice zip-tied to what was left of the trunk. HOA Violation, Unauthorized Tree, Removal Enforced, Fine, $500. Contact Board President Deborah Whitmore for appeals. Deborah Whitmore. My stomach twisted into knots. I should have known. I turned, and there she was, standing at the end of my driveway like a goddamn villain, arms folded, a smug little smile pulling at her thin lips. She was exactly what you'd picture when you heard the words HOA President. 50-something, sharp-angled bob, pastel sweater, the kind of woman who'd call the cops on a lemonade stand without a permit. "Afternoon, Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I was wondering when you'd get home." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not without saying something I'd regret. She stepped forward, clasping her hands in front of her, like she was some benevolent ruler. "I know this must be a shock, but you were warned. Section 8, Subsection C of the HOA Guidelines, unapproved flora. And after multiple warnings—" "There were no warnings," I snapped. She smiled wider, like a teacher humoring a dumb student. "Actually, there were 3 notices, sent by mail. Perhaps you should check your records more carefully." Lies. I never got a single letter. "You had no right," I said, voice tight with rage. "Oh, but I did." She pulled out a folder, flipping it, open with a manicured nail. "The HOA board voted unanimously last week. We have jurisdiction over any landscaping that disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the community." I clenched my jaw. "It was a damn tree, Deborah. A tree. And an unapproved one," she said, as if that settled it. A silence stretched between us, thick with tension. She tilted her head. "If it makes you feel any better, you can plant a new one, so long as it's within regulation." A hollow, stunned laugh escaped me. "You destroyed my daughter's memorial and expect me to feel better?" "Rules are rules, Mr. Grayson," she said, completely unaffected. Then, with a dramatic sigh, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a community to run. I trust you'll process your fine promptly." And just like that, she turned and walked away. I stood there, frozen in place, my blood boiling. I could already see the neighbors peeking from behind their curtains, watching, waiting. No one would say a damn thing. No one would stand up to her. Because this wasn't the first time Deborah Whitmore had wielded her power like a sledgehammer. She fined the Rodriguez family $800 for leaving their Christmas lights up a week too long. She banned the Parkers from hosting a birthday party in their own backyard because of a noise complaint that never happened. She tried to evict an elderly couple for excessive lawn clutter when all they had was a single flower pot outside their front door. And now she came for me. But what Deborah didn't know was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because earlier that morning, at the HOA meeting she so graciously skipped, I was elected as the new HOA governor, and I wasn't going to let this stand. But I wasn't going to act yet. No. Deborah Whitmore was the type of woman who thrived on control, on knowing she had absolute power over people's lives. If she thought she still had it, she'd overplay her hand. And I wanted her to dig her own grave. I clenched my fists, forcing my voice into something calm. something patient. "All right, Deborah, you win. I'll pay your fine." She barely hid her surprise, her lips twitching in amusement. A wise decision. I watched her walk away, my pulse still hammering, but my mind already working 3 steps ahead. I needed to see just how far she was willing to go, how much power she thought she had. And Deborah. She took the bait. By the next morning, there was another fine taped to my door. HOA violation. Grass height exceeds regulations. Fine. $250. I stared at it, jaw tightening. I had mowed my lawn 3 days ago. It was pristine, but I didn't react. I simply removed the notice and went about my day. That evening, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Another violation, this time for a non-conforming mailbox. My mailbox, identical to every single one on the street. 2 days later, a threat of further disciplinary action for failure to maintain driveway aesthetics. Deborah was escalating. She thought I was another resident she could bulldoze into submission, and the more I didn't fight back, the more she pressed. I watched it happen like clockwork. My neighbor, Mrs. Connolly, a widow in her 70s, whispered to me over the fence. She hit me with a fine last week, said my curtains weren't neutral, enough for community standards. Jason, the single dad 3 houses down, murmured, "She's trying to ban street parking now. Says it damages the neighborhood's curb appeal." I work nights, man. I don't have a driveway. It was getting worse. Deborah didn't just want control. She wanted to rule. And then she made her biggest move yet. The next evening, I was sitting on my porch, sipping a beer, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when I heard the sharp clack of heels on pavement. Deborah. She walked up my driveway like she owned it, her ever-present clipboard tucked under her arm. "Good evening, Mr. Grayson," she said smoothly. "I see you've been ignoring your notices." I exhaled slowly. "I'm not ignoring them, Deborah. I'm just not reacting the way you want." Her smile thinned. "Regardless, failure to comply will result in escalating consequences." She pulled a fresh document from her clipboard and held it out. "I suggest you read this one carefully." I took it. Final notice. Show board review for noncompliance. Failure to rectify ongoing violations may result in property lien or forced compliance action. I let out a low chuckle. "A lien? You think you can put a lien on my house?" She smirked. "I don't think, Mr. Grayson, I know." She had the gall to wink before turning on her heel and walking away. I stood there watching her go, every muscle in my body tight with restrained fury. She really thought she was untouchable, and that's when I knew it was time to start playing back. The next morning, I went to the HOA office, the small, unassuming brick building that sat on the edge of the neighborhood, the place where Deborah held her little kingdom together. The receptionist, a timid young woman named Anna, looked up nervously when I walked in. "Hi, Mr. Grayson," she said. "What can I do for you?" I leaned on the counter, lowering my voice. "Deborah's been busy, hasn't she?" Anna swallowed, glancing at the empty hallway. She's been making a lot of changes. Some of them weren't even voted on by the board." "Bingo." I lowered my voice even more. "Has she been keeping records?" Anna hesitated, then nodded. "She makes everything official, but some of it doesn't go through the proper channels." "Like the tree removal?" Anna winced. I nodded. That told me everything I needed to know. I smiled. "Anna, I think you and I are going to help this community, but I need your discretion." Her eyes flickered with something. Maybe hope, maybe fear, but she nodded. "Okay." I left the office with a growing sense of certainty. Deborah had been operating in the shadows, twisting the HOA bylaws to suit her personal vendettas, but she wasn't as careful as she thought. I just needed to find the crack in her armor. And then Deborah overplayed her hand. That night, I woke to flashing red and blue lights outside my house. I threw on a shirt, stepping outside to see 2 police officers standing on my lawn. My stomach sank. Deborah stood beside them, her arms crossed, a look of pure satisfaction on her face. "Officers," I said slowly. "What's going on?" One of them cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report that you were harassing the HOA President." I stared at them, then at Deborah. She was really trying to frame me. "That's a lie," I said flatly. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence of harassment?" Deborah's lips curled. Multiple written notices ignored, verbal altercations, intimidation tactics. He even entered the HOA office unannounced. I laughed. "Unannounced?" I spoke to the receptionist. She let me in. She tisked. "Regardless, this neighborhood has rules, and I won't tolerate threats to our peaceful way of life." The officer sighed. "Sir, I just need to ask. Do you have any intention of harming Ms. Whitmore?" I exhaled slowly. "None." They exchanged glances. One of them rubbed his temple. "All right, Ms. Whitmore, unless you have actual evidence of a threat, there's nothing we can do here." Deborah's face twisted. She expected them to drag me away. The officers nodded to me before heading back to their patrol car. Deborah turned to me, her voice sharp. "This is your only warning, Mr. Grayson." I leaned in just enough that only she could hear me. "You have no idea who you just picked a fight with." She scoffed, turning to leave, but I saw something in her eyes. Doubt. And that's when I knew I had her. She was finally starting to realize she wasn't as untouchable as she thought, but knowing wasn't enough. I needed her to feel it. The next morning, I was greeted by a new notice taped to my front door. This one was bigger, bolder, more official looking. Notice of HOA Governor Review. Final warning. Failure to comply with HOA mandates may result in escalated action, up to and including legal repercussions, property lien enforcement, and additional monetary fines. And at the bottom, Deborah's signature, big and looping, like some medieval queen stamping a death warrant. I let out a slow breath, folding the paper neatly before shoving it into my pocket. She was panicking. She had to be. She had played this game 100 times before, against people who couldn't fight back. But I wasn't just some homeowner with no recourse, and she was about to find that out the hard way. I paid another visit to the HOA office later that afternoon. Anna, the receptionist, looked more nervous than usual. "She's inside," she whispered, nodding toward the closed office door. "She's been making calls all day. Something's got her rattled." Good. I knocked once before pushing the door open. Deborah was on the phone, but when she saw me, she visibly stiffened. Her fingers tightened around the receiver, her lips pursed so hard they nearly disappeared. "Yes, I understand. No, that won't be necessary." She shot me a glare. "I have everything under control." She hung up before whoever was on the other end could respond. For the first time since this war began, she looked uneasy. "You don't have an appointment," she said, smoothing out her blouse like she could iron away her irritation. "Nope," I said, stepping inside and shutting the door behind me. "I figured since you like to drop by unannounced, I'd return the favor." Her nostrils flared, but she forced a smile. "What do you want, Mr. Grayson?" I tossed her latest threat onto her desk. "You tell me. You've been busy." She barely glanced at it before leaning back in her chair. "As I said before, rules are rules. You've made it very clear that you don't respect them." I crossed my arms. "You're right. I don't respect your rules." She narrowed her eyes. I stepped closer. "See, the problem with making up regulations as you go is that you forget to cover your tracks." Her face remained impassive, but I saw it, the slight twitch in her jaw. I smiled. Anna's been very helpful. Now that got a reaction. Her head snapped toward the door, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" She gave me access to the real HOA records. "The ones you didn't, Doctor." Silence. I pulled out a folder and placed it on her desk. "Let's start with your unauthorized tree removals." She didn't move. I flipped the folder open, revealing copies of actual HOA votes, ones where she claimed unanimous decisions that never happened. Votes she had forged. She stared at them, her face an unreadable mask. Then there's the financial discrepancies. I pulled out another sheet. "You've been fining homeowners, but those fines, they never made it to the HOA's general fund." Curious, isn't it? The silence stretched. She swallowed. Just once. But it was enough. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping. You were careful, Deborah. I'll give you that. But you got greedy. Too many fake fines. Too many unanimous board decisions when half the board didn't even know they were on record. And now? I tapped the papers. Now, I have proof. A long pause. Then, slowly, she tilted her head, a tight smile curling at the edges of her mouth. You think you've won, don't you? I didn't answer. She tapped a finger against the desk. Let me tell you something, Mr. Grayson. This neighborhood is built on order. People don't want to live in chaos. They want someone like me to make sure things stay the way they should be. Deborah, you're not enforcing order, I said, shaking my head. You're running a dictatorship. Her smile didn't waver. She exhaled through her nose, stood up, and smoothed her skirt. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop this. You're going to forget whatever nonsense you think you found, and in return... She leaned forward. I won't bury you. I raised an eyebrow. Bury me? Oh, don't. Play dumb. She waved a hand. I can make your life miserable. More fines. More violations. And if that's not enough... Her voice turned low and sharp. I'll take your house. I blinked once. You're threatening to take my house? She smiled wider. I don't make threats, Mr. Grayson. I make promises. I stared at her. She actually believed this. She thought she could win. That's when I laughed, a full, genuine, uncontrollable laugh that wiped the smug look right off her face. Oh, Deborah, I said, shaking my head. You have no idea what's coming, do you? Her smile flickered. I leaned in, lowering my voice. You think you're the queen of this little neighborhood, that you can control everything. But there's one thing you didn't consider. She straightened. And what's that? I smirked. The HOA governor's authority outranks the board president. Her breath hitched. And there it was. Fear. She recovered quickly, scoffing. That position is honorary. You have no real power. I tapped the folder again. That's where you're wrong. See, I've been doing my research. The HOA charter? It's very clear. The governor has the ability to call a full community vote to override any board decisions, including removing a corrupt president. Her face drained of color. I pushed the folder toward her. And you, Deborah? You just made yourself the perfect case study. The air between us crackled with tension. For the first time, she looked cornered. I stepped back, giving her a small nod. I'll see you at the next community meeting. Then I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, silent, frozen. But I wasn't done yet, because that was just the first part of her downfall, and she had no idea what was coming next. For the next 3 days, I laid the groundwork. I spent my time talking to the neighbors, really talking to them. Not just about Deborah's ridiculous fines and her fabricated rules, but about everything she had done. The stolen fines, the forged HOA votes, the personal vendettas dressed up as policy. People had been afraid to speak up before, afraid that if they pushed back, they'd be targeted like I was. But when they realized they weren't alone, that fear turned into something else. Anger. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the community was ready, and so was I. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, the same place where Deborah had run her little empire for years. But tonight was different. By the time I arrived, the room was packed. More people than I had ever seen at a board meeting. I spotted Jason near the back, arms crossed. Mrs. Connolly sat in the front row, her lips pressed together in quiet determination. Even Anna, the HOA receptionist, was there, hovering near the wall like she wanted to disappear. But she was here, because tonight the neighborhood wasn't Deborah's, it was ours. Deborah, for her part, sat in her usual chair at the front of the room, her expression carefully neutral. But I saw it, the slight stiffness in her posture, the way her fingers gripped her clipboard a little too tightly. She was nervous. Good. I took my seat at the table, my seat, and cleared my throat. Let's get started. Deborah's gaze snapped. To me, her lips twitching in irritation. She hated that she wasn't in control, but she forced a smile. Before we proceed, I believe we need to address some rather serious allegations that have been made against me. Murmurs rippled through the room. I gestured toward the audience. You're absolutely right. And since these allegations involve the entire community, I think it's only fair we hear from them. She blinked, caught off guard. That's not... But before she could finish, Jason spoke up. You fined me 3 times last month, he said, voice steady. I claimed I was parking illegally when the HOA rules allow overnight street parking. Where'd that money go, Deborah? She barely had time to react before Mrs. Connolly added, I'd like to know why I was fined for my curtains, Deborah. You told me they weren't neutral enough. Deborah's smile thinned. There are policies. Another voice cut her off. You tore down the Grayson's tree. Murmurs grew louder. Someone else spoke, then another, and another. It was a domino effect. Every single injustice, every unfair fine, every fabricated rule, it all came crashing down on her at once. And for the first time, Deborah had no control. She raised a hand, trying to quiet the crowd. Now, let's not... I slammed a folder onto the table. The room went silent. Slowly, deliberately, I opened it. These, I said, voice even, are copies of every forged vote you submitted as unanimous. I pulled out another set of papers. These are records of fines you issued, funds that never reached the HOA account. I turned to Anna. Would you like to confirm? Anna swallowed, but nodded. That's correct. Deborah's face turned pale. I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough so the whole room had to strain to hear. Deborah, the HOA charter is very clear. The governor has the right to call for a full community vote to remove any board. Member suspected of corruption. I smiled. And guess what? We're voting tonight. The silence stretched long and heavy. Deborah snapped. This is a joke, she spat, shoving to her feet. You all think you can just throw me out? I built this community. I kept order while the rest of you lived in chaos. You needed me. No, Jason said, standing. You needed us to be afraid. She turned on him. But before... She could finish, someone called out. All in favor of removing Deborah Whitmore as HOA president? Hands shot up. All of them, every single one. Even Anna, even the other board members who had been too scared to stand up to her before. Deborah froze. She looked around, her breath coming faster, her face twisting between denial and fury. This isn't... You're out, Deborah. I said it calmly, but the weight behind the words was absolute. She shook her head, like she could force reality to bend to her will. No, I still have... I slid one last paper across the table. She hesitated, then snatched it up, scanning the words. Her hands trembled, because it wasn't just an eviction from the HOA board. It was a lawsuit, filed on behalf of the community, citing financial misconduct, abuse of authority, and fraud. Her entire empire was crumbling, and she knew it. She stood there shaking, breathing hard, face blotchy with rage and humiliation. Then, finally, she did the one thing I never thought I'd see. She turned and walked out. No parting words, no final threats, just silence. And then, as the door swung shut behind her, cheers erupted. The aftermath was swift. Deborah fought, of course. She tried to challenge the vote, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her fake fines, her stolen money, it was all laid out in black and white. The lawsuit moved forward. She was forced to pay restitution, a small price for the damage she'd done. And as for the HOA, we changed everything. We rewrote the rules, stripping the board of unchecked power. The community got a real voice. No more absurd fines, no more intimidation. And as for me, I planted a new tree, right in the same spot where the old one had been. This time, no one could touch it, because this wasn't Deborah's neighborhood anymore, it was ours.